Welcome back on the SpaceInfo podcast. Today we'll talk about 3 facts about the International Space Station that maybe you don't know. First of all, thank you for being here, thank you for interacting with our community and for listening to the trailer episode of this podcast. We really appreciate your commitment and your participation in the community. So don't be shy, comment, share, and let us know what do you think about this podcast and in particular this episode, about 3 facts that maybe you didn't know about the International Space Station. Today we talk about something that you asked us on our social, particularly on Instagram and YouTube. One thing that maybe you didn't know about the space station is how to reach it. So how do you lift up from Earth, get in orbit and then dock to the International Space Station? Well, we'll get as an example the latest mission of Axiom, the AX-3 mission, and we'll see how it reaches the orbit and then docks to the International Space Station. We can divide the path to orbit into some different stages and then the final one, which is the docking. First thing is lifting off from Earth. This mission lifted off in Cape Canaveral in Florida on board of a Falcon 9 rocket, but it is just little more than a detail. Indeed, any rocket basically makes the same thing, particularly from liftoff into orbital injection. The very first climb to orbit is very stiff, almost vertical, but after a practically vertical initial phase, the rocket rotates around its pitch axis and comes almost horizontal, flying around the Earth. Depending on the nature of the mission, the altitude from the surface can vary. However, usually we have already a circular orbit, clearly at lower altitude of the one of the International Space Station. But most of the space companies use this circular orbit as a first checkout orbit. Indeed, some flight parameters and system parameters of the capsule are checked out, and if the crew on board and the people on the ground don't really like some parameters, even just one, they can let the crew return home and abort the mission. When flying the space shuttle, the use was an intermediate phase, and usually the spacecraft was upside down with the upper part of the spacecraft facing the Earth. But now, after reaching this first circular orbit, a transfer from this lower orbit to a higher one is usually executed. This was the case this time. But how did I do this? Don't forget that in space every maneuver requires energy. Energy is required to accelerate the capsule but also to brake it. You have a certain amount of fuel into your tanks and you use this fuel both to accelerate and to brake the capsule. So don't forget that every maneuver has a cost, and this cost is in terms of energy, which means fuel in your tanks. And if you end up this fuel, your mission is basically ended. Therefore, at a certain point, the crew on board, in accord with the people on the ground, activated the rockets of the capsule and they accelerated the spacecraft in order to change orbit. There is a variation in velocity given to the spacecraft, which allows the orbit to transform from a circular one to an elliptical one, up to a point where the orbit is again changed. This elliptical orbit is circularized, which means that the crew on board, again, according to what the ground is saying, accelerate again the capsule, and the final orbit is again circular. However, this circular orbit is at much higher altitude with respect to the first one. Usually the International Space Station soars the Earth at 400 kilometers or 250 miles. What they performed here is technically defined as a no-man transfer. If you want to learn more about what a no-man transfer is, just tell us in the comments or on our social. Contact us and let us know, so we'll make a podcast episode on this. Now the final phases approach. What's very important to note throughout the whole mission is that the spacecraft launched from Earth must be synchronized with the International Space Station. But what I mean by synchronized? You can launch the spacecraft almost in any time you want. However, once you are on the first circular orbit, you must be very careful on when executing the accelerating maneuver which transferred the spacecraft from the first orbit to the second one. This because the final position of the spacecraft must already be close to the International Space Station. Just think about this situation. You are driving your car, you enter a roundabout and there is a car in front of you. If you accelerate, you can just get closer to that car. If you brake, you just put a higher distance between you and the front car. However, in space, things are a little different. If you're flying a circular orbit and then you accelerate, it happens that the whole orbit becomes bigger in radius, which means that you're flying at a high altitude. So you don't actually get closer to the target in front of you, but you are just flying higher. And this is just physics. So in this case, the spacecraft which is targeting the station applies what's called a phasing maneuver. Phasing, which means that you are synchronizing yourself in space with respect to the target you're flying towards. You're sort of accelerating and braking while you're driving your car in that roundabout of the example. Simply, you are actuating different kind of maneuvers, not just accelerating in one direction or braking, but synchronizing yourself with the spacecraft you're targeting. Once you get very close to the station, there is one important thing you have to consider. The station has a keep-out sphere. But what is this? This keep-out sphere is not a physical object. It's just a limit that people design around the station. So if you get too close to the station and you're not ready to perform an escaping maneuver, or you just simply lose control of your spacecraft, the station must be protected. So you are authorized from the ground to enter the keep-out sphere only where you're 100% sure that you will not impact the station, and then you finalize the docking maneuver just by getting closer and closer and get connected to the hatch. Now that you perfectly know how to drive and dock your spacecraft to the International Space Station, maybe you're asking other two questions. Number one is, do people live in the spacecraft according to a specific time zone? And number two is the spacecraft ever rotated or moved over its orbit? Let's start by answering the first question. Well, people live on the International Space Station according to UTC time, which means the Coordinated Universal Time. This can be quite impractical for people living in America or in Russia to coordinate themselves with the station. Indeed, some issue occurred in the past when people in Moscow cannot reach the control center during night simply because the subway in Moscow was closed at night. Apart from this little issue, ground control on Earth synchronizes with the station, and people on the station cannot change their time zone according to the country they are flying over every time. Maybe you didn't know, but the space station only takes 1 hour and a half to complete a single orbit, so changing your time zone according to the country, like when you fly your plane around the world, is not very practical. So the choice of the UTC time zone is just a common decision to facilitate the control of the station and the people living on the Earth. In the past it was not the case. In particular, during the shuttle missions, people used the MET, which means mission elapsed time. So you just get the count of how much time is passed from the launch, impractical for the International Space Station and cannot be done considering a spacecraft which has been flying for over 20 years. On top of this, before coming to the second question, maybe you didn't know that people on the ground works according to work shift. Yes, exactly. People work in factories, people on the ground work on shifts of 8 hours, apart from the Capcom, who is a person designated by the astronauts usually, and usually he is an astronaut himself or herself, who is the only person authorized to talk with the people on board of the spacecraft. Well, now the things has a little changed, and maybe the Capcom is not an astronaut, but in the past, people during Apollo missions, Gemini missions, and the very first space missions, the Capcom were astronauts and were the only authorized by people on the spacecraft to talk with them, bridging the communication with the ground segment. Now we come to the last question. Is the space station ever rotated, or do people on the ground ever change its orbit? Well, maybe you didn't know, but the answer is yes. There are two main reasons. First reason is that the International Space Station is orbiting Earth at around 400 kilometers, but there are some perturbations that causes it to just lower its orbit. So when people on the ground just detected that the station is flying too low, the station is brought back its initial altitude. But there is another reason why the spacecraft is rotated, or its height to the ground is changed, and this reason are space debris. Debris can be tracked from the ground with radar. In particular, the bigger ones are tracked and their orbit is estimated. So if you see that their trajectory is going to impact the station, and you know this in terms of hours or maybe days before, you don't have any control on the debris, but you have control on the station. So you just change its attitude, which means the orientation, but usually, most of the cases, you change its altitude, which means the height from the ground, again in the order of meters, and you just simply avoid the impact with the debris. But this is all for today. I hope I have answered all your questions, but I strongly invite you to comment and ask us other questions on our social channels. I'll leave you with one question from me. What happens when a space debris impacts the space station? Has this ever happened?